Hello, this is Petty Wap. Today we're going to talk about how British actions inspired the American Revolution. So let's get to it. The first thing we want to look at today is the French and Indian War. Now, this was fought between 1754 and 1763, and as you can tell, that is before America declared our independence from Great Britain. So the French and Indian War was fought primarily over land in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and even though this sounds like the French were fighting against the Indians, the French and the Indians were actually on the same side, and they were fighting against the colonists and the British, okay? So eventually, when the French and Indian War ends in 1763, Great Britain realizes that, war costs a lot of money. So what happens? In order to rebuild their treasury to try to get back some of the money that they had spent in the colonies, Great Britain decides to implement a whole series of taxes. So starting with the three more famous taxes or acts that you've talked about in your other classes. Starting with the Sugar Act of 1764, this placed a tax on everything dealing with sugar. So we're talking about sugar, molasses, rum, all of those different things saw an additional tax placed upon them. The Stamp Act in 1765 was never actually placed into effect because the colonists freaked out so much about it. And basically, there were so many riots that Great Britain was almost forced to take back the Stamp Act. But this was supposed to place a tax on any paper items. So if you can think about your birth certificate, if you've ever actually touched your birth certificate, it has like that embossed seal on it of the state of Missouri. That's similar to what the stamp would have been on the stamped paper. So basically anything that you had, like any legal document, like a marriage license or a birth certificate, anything like that had to be printed on that stamped paper, and you had to pay a specific tax for that stamped paper. They also were going to put that embossed seal on playing cards and dice. So the colonists saw this as like Great Britain trying to take over all aspects of their life, but that never went into effect. And the Tea Act was kind of like the last straw. The Tea Act of 1773, it actually did not place an increased tax on British tea, and this is kind of something that people get confused about. The Tea Act of 1773 granted what's called a monopoly to the East India Company. Okay, now a monopoly basically will allow one company to control all parts of that specific market. So instead of having British tea and Dutch tea sold in the colonies, basically it was going to make it really, really cheap to sell this British tea. Now, English people during this time period drank tea kind of like I drink coffee. So that would be like if the federal government told me that I had to buy one type of coffee and maybe I didn't like that type of coffee. I would flip a lid, right? Same type of thing happened here with the Tea Act. So you all know the story. The Tea Act then led to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, some of our founding fathers dressed up like Indians and raided British merchant ships, dumping that tea into Boston Harbor. And if you're Great Britain, you're not going to be really happy about that. So that prompted Great Britain to pass what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts and what Great Britain called the Coercive Acts, which basically, it did a few different things, but the goal of it was to tighten British control on the colonies. Okay, so one example in the Intolerable Acts was the Boston Port Act, and that closed Boston Harbor. Now, Boston Harbor was kind of like the economic hub for New England, so that definitely was going to have a huge impact on the colonists. So in the 1750s, and I'm kind of backtracking here a little bit, some founding fathers met in Albany, New York at the Albany Congress. And they basically were trying to come up with an idea like, are we going to become unified or are we going to stay under British rule? What's going to happen? So they ended up and they drafted something called the Albany Plan of Union. Now, it's not listed on here, but I would write that down if I were you. The Albany Plan of Union was the first plan for unification in the colonies, but it failed because the colonists were kind of leery of it because it gave a whole lot of power to one group of people it was basically like a representative body. So they didn't want too much concentrated power because they were thinking, hey, that's just going to be like what we have under England, so what's the point? Moving on then to the First Continental Congress. So after Great Britain passes the Intolerable Acts, the colonists are kind of like, okay, we got to do something. So what do? They meet at the First Continental Congress, and almost all of the 13 colonies send a representative. And the only thing that really comes from the First Continental Congress is that they agree to pass something called an embargo against Great Britain. Now, an embargo, in case you didn't know, is basically a prohibition of trade. So the United States and Great Britain were trade partners. So if we just decide all of a sudden we're not going to trade with Great Britain, then that's not only going to affect their economy, but it's also going to affect our economy. The First Continental Congress then leads to the Battle of Lexington and Concord in April 19, 1775, which of course is the shot heard around the world. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, which in turn leads to the Second Continental Congress. So after we've got these battles kind of brewing in the northeastern part of the United States, the founders meet once again. Representatives from almost all of the colonies meet again, and they decide, you know what, we're going to kind of take on the power or the role of a central government. Okay, so they're like providing weapons and they're providing currency, and they also named John Hancock to be the president of the Second Continental Congress. And the Second Continental Congress is what is basically functioning as our central government all the way up through the Articles of Confederation. So they're around for quite a while. So moving on then to independence, yay! Richard Henry Lee, who was a Virginian, submitted what's called his resolution in June of 1776. And basically, it was the proposal that we should go ahead and sever our political ties from Great Britain, that we should go ahead and become our own unified country. So this was adopted, and it was actually written and presented to the Continental Congress on July 2nd, 1776. And of course, July 4th, 1776 is when we actually formally declare independence from Great Britain. And formally, I mean, that's when people actually started signing the document. And we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence in class and kind of look at a couple of the different sections of it. And you'll have a bonus mission with that as well. So scooting on then to unification. We've got the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation is probably something that you don't talk about a whole heck of a lot, or maybe don't really remember a lot about from American history. But the Articles of Confederation was our first attempt at self-government in the United States. Okay, and I definitely want you to know that, the first attempt at self-government. Now, the Articles were very weak because they did not have an executive or a judicial branch. It was also a unicameral legislature, which means only one branch in Congress. But the goal of it was to create a really weak central government, because our founders were like, no, we're not going to have a super strong central government like we had under Great Britain. So eventually, the founding fathers and our federal government realized, you know what, if we're going to be a good functioning government, we probably need to have a little more power. So we have a few different things that happen that lead up to the creation of our Constitution. The first, we've got boundary disputes. So basically, these different states were arguing among themselves as to whose boundary was where and whose territory was what. And the Articles of Confederation granted the federal government very limited power. So they could basically just like suggest solutions to these problems. War debt, foreign and domestic war debt. War costs a lot of money, people, and the federal government had no authority to tax, so they had no authority to generate money, so they couldn't pay their debts. That led to an economic depression. And that also leads to a group of farmers who get together and they are freaking out because they're promised their pension. But guess what? The federal government can't pay them because they have no money. So you've got Daniel Shays and some other Revolutionary War soldiers who basically storm the state buildings in Massachusetts and like stall federal or stall state procedures. And then the founders are like, oh my gosh, if a whole bunch of farmers with pitchforks can upset or upend and totally like destroy the functions of government in a state, then maybe we ought to do something. So they did. They decided to meet at the Annapolis Convention in Maryland, and they were going to discuss issues of interstate commerce. So it's like discussing currency issues, discussing trading between the states. And that is where I will leave you for today. If you have any questions, let me know.